Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to the first panel on the second day of our live webinar series, Recognizing the Growing Economic Impact of Patent Licensing. My name is Brian Pomper. I'm the Executive Director of the Innovation Alliance, one of the co-sponsors of this series. Thanks to our other co-sponsors, the Licensing Executives Society U.S.A. and Canada, the Licensing Executives Society International, the Global Innovation Policy Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Autumn, and IPWatchdog. This first panel today is entitled The Economic Contribution of Licensing to the U.S. Economy. Our moderator is Quinn, the founder, president, and CEO of IPWatchdog, and of course, one of the sponsors of this conference. Before I turn it over to Jean, a note to our viewers. If you have a question you would like to ask the panel, please use the chat function by clicking on the icon in the row of icons at the bottom of your screen. Now, over to you, Jean.
Great, thanks a lot, Brian. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate all of the sponsors having this very important and timely discussion about licensing and the importance of licensing for the U.S. economy. I think we're going to have a fascinating conversation, so let's just get to it. Let me introduce our panelists. I'll start by introducing Walter Copan. Dr. Copan is the director at NIST. He's Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technologies. And prior to joining NIST, he had a distinguished career, and he is an expert in licensing, and he has expertise in licensing both in small and large corporations. He's licensing with respect to the U.S. government, nonprofits, and other public sector settings. So Dr. Copan, we're honored to have you join us here today. Thank you for spending some time with us. We also have Eric Victory joining us. Eric is the VP of Global Strategic Marketing at Aurinia. Oh, I'm not going to be able to say that now that I'm trying to.
Aurinia
Pharmaceuticals in Rockville, Maryland. So Eric has previously worked at AstraZeneca MedImmune unit and is as a VP of partnering and strategy for the head of the cardiovascular, metabolic, and infectious disease unit. And we're glad to have Eric bringing with us today some expertise in the life sciences area. Also bringing expertise in the life sciences area is Hans Sauer, who is the Deputy General Counsel for Intellectual Property at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. And the Bio is a major trade organization many of you are probably familiar with. Over 1,100 companies part of Bio. And Hans is also a professor. He's on the board of directors of various organizations. He takes part in amicus committees. So we're very pleased to have Hans Sauer with us here today. And last, but certainly not least, is John Dubiansky, and he is the Director of Intellectual Property Service, Director of Intellectual Property and Standards Policy at Dolby. And he is responsible for policy issues relating to intellectual property and standardization arising from various fora, including governments and standards developing organizations. So gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for this very important conversation. And what I'd like to do is kick us off with a sort of a round robin question, very open-ended question, intending to allow you to go in whatever direction that you might want to go to start us off in. And let's just go in order here as you appear on my screen. And what is it that you would like those people in the audience to keep in mind as we start to have this conversation about the importance of licensing to the U.S. economy? Eric, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks, Gene, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As one who's been in the biopharmaceutical industry for about 20 years at this point, I think the key thing to point out is that licensing offers an efficient way to transfer appropriate rights to patents and other intellectual property among organizations that may have very distinct but very necessary capabilities. So for example, it's often the case that some of the most foundational and important medical discoveries are made by researchers at academic institutions or scientists, for example, at small biotech companies. Those are typically places that do not necessarily have the experience, scale, or capacity to do things like run large human clinical trials, manufacture products for commercial use, or field a commercial organization to ultimately bring products to market. And licensing offers a way to transfer those rights so that innovative, important discoveries coming out of small institutions can actually ultimately make their way out to benefit the population at large.
Great. John, your preliminary thoughts. What do you think is important for people to keep in mind?
Sure. Well, I think licensing is very important to Dolby Laboratories. And I think that our experience is a great experience for how licensing can benefit other companies, particularly in ICT, but also in the economy at large. Dolby is an American company. We've been around since the 60s, and our mission and purpose is really to deliver superior audio and visual experiences to consumers. And if you think about going to the cinema or the movie theater and you're immersed in sound and you see very crisp and high contrast video being displayed, that reflects the idea that the movie producer had in his mind when he mastered a film, that is the experience we want to deliver. But the reality of modern life is that consumers are increasingly receiving this video content through a variety of different technologies and different pathways. You have cinema, you have television, you have streaming on the internet, and you have mobile phones, and even within television now you have broadcast and discs and other mechanisms. And licensing is important because it allows Dolby to contribute. You know, Dolby is a fairly small company, and for most of our history, we have relied upon licensing to consumers, licensing the manufacturers of consumer products in order to get our products into the homes of consumers. To this day, the vast majority of our revenues actually come from licensing, and by and large, we don't manufacture consumer products ourselves. Nevertheless, many consumers are familiar with our brand and our experience, and our ability to continue to innovate in this space. Our ability to focus on R&D and innovation over the years has been not only a great benefit to us, but is a great example of how licensing models, by allowing companies who choose to focus on innovation and R&D and to continue to do so over time, can often create very great results for consumers and bring new technologies to markets in ways that would otherwise not be available. I'll speak to this more later, but by focusing on R&D, we've been able to both apply our technologies to new and divergent end uses as they emerge in the market. And also we've been able to focus on continual improvement and multi-generational innovation, improving our technologies because we have the ability to focus on doing so. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, John. Dr. Copan, your initial thoughts on licensing. I know you've had a long career, and now NIST has become quite an active player in a way that they have not been before.
Thank you very much, Gene, and it's a real honor to join with this distinguished panel. It's very clear that the research at federal agencies and federally funded research at the laboratories and universities of our nation play a major role in many critical sectors of the U.S. economy. And licensing is the pathway to create value in the economy, to transition technologies. In many cases, the underpinnings of the U.S. innovation system is having clear, reliable, and enforceable intellectual property rights. We've seen tech transfer and innovation pathways change dramatically since the Bayh-Dole and Stevenson-Weidler legislation 40 years ago. The innovation ecosystems, entrepreneurship, startups, the needs for co-development and open innovation, new categories of agile public partnerships require us to take a fresh look at our innovation system, the legislation and policy underpinning them. And so we're thrilled to have the return on investment initiative underway nationally, taking a fresh look at Stevenson-Weidler and also looking to preserve all those essential elements of Bayh-Dole for the important work of the nation's innovators. And at NIST, sometimes we say that standards are our middle name, right? National Institute of Standards and Technology. And standards provide a foundation of trust in the economy and for innovators and licensees to deliver value. And in December of 2019, NIST, together with the Patent and Trademark Office and the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, issued a joint policy statement on remedies for standards essential patent subject to voluntary FRAND commitments. And so we're delighted to have that policy piece out as an opportunity to rebalance the abilities of implementers and innovators alike. And standards create value in our economy, and I know that many of our panelists are very, very focused on that. And so it's sometimes hard to look at the overall economic impacts from licensing. It's sometimes difficult to translate, and some data is proprietary. But it's a very, very important part of our economy, and certainly the good work of Autumn, the Federal Laboratory Consortium, to try to capture and convey that value is a journey that we're on.
Yeah, it's a very important journey, and I'll come back to you for more. Let's get Hans to weigh in on his preliminary thoughts. Hans, what do you want folks to focus on, at least initially, as we begin this conversation?
Well, so thanks for calling on me last, because as we were going through the
they all took everything you wanted to say.
I was checking off, well, I'm not going to say this anymore. I'm not going to say it. Now Dr. Copan really stole something that I thought, okay, I'm going to maybe focus on this. Okay, maybe I'm going to give you a little bit of a composite, and perhaps it contains something slightly original. If I had to reinforce one thing I've heard from the fellow panelists, I would say that it's very important to keep in mind that bringing innovative products to the market, for the most part, in most industries, is a collaborative effort, not just of one company that puts its name on the product that you buy, but of other businesses and other entities, some of which are publicly funded entities that played an important role in the product's past, on its path to development. And in biotech, especially, we often use the term the value chain, where you think of a product as moving up, a chain of increasing sophistication, of increasing levels of proof, of increasing confidence that the product will work and can be developed over time, and frankly, of increasing value at that stage of its development chain. And often at different parts of that chain, you will find different actors who have different special skills, different companies, or publicly funded institutions that all contribute what they can do best. We often hear, from more commercially minded investor type folks, they talk about assets, which really are products that are still under development and far from the market, but they're assets nonetheless that become more valuable as more work is done by different entities who facilitate their collaborations through licensing. And they often tell us that assets can be worth more or can be worth less depending on the hands in which they are at any given point of development. So moving technology between those who are best positioned to advance it to the next level absolutely relies on licensing and robust legal systems. It is a good deal, not just commercially for companies who are able to engage in rational licensing, but it is a good deal for the American public, which through the laws that Dr. Copan mentioned, has been able to leverage public investment in basic research into large amounts of follow-on privately funded capital that is then made possible to pour into further development of whatever fruits of basically funded research we're talking about. It's not just medicines, it's just what I know best, but it's also known in other areas. We wouldn't have battery technology that we see in the marketplace today if it weren't for some distant, in the past, significant federal investment in studying feasibility of energy storage and batteries. So keep in mind, right, that for every public research dollar the public invests, licensing makes possible the recruitment of 10 to 100 to 1,000 times that amount in private capital that gets poured and that gets recruited through the mechanism of licensing. I think it's a good deal for society to have predictable rules for licensing and to have a legal system that facilitates the technology transfer and collaboration we're seeing. And that's especially pertinent maybe now during times of COVID, where collaboration and licensing is really a hallmark of the public-private response. Maybe we'll get back to that, but those would be the words that I would start with.
Wow, okay, so we really probably need about 3 hours to cover all this great, wonderful information, but maybe we should hit the nail that Hans has raised squarely and hard right here, right now. Because in this COVID world, let me take a step back. My perception, and feel free to disagree if you disagree, is that there are a group of people out there, so this is Gene talking, that whenever there's an opportunity to take away patent rights or take away intellectual property rights or proprietary rights of any kind, or weaken licensing, or make it more difficult for creators, or to say that everything needs to be free, however you want to characterize it, they take that opportunity. You know, they always want to use a crisis as a way to take rights away from creators. So COVID is just the latest chapter. And we see that you have a number of companies that have received money from the federal government, and then they have the audacity to then go and charge additional sums of money for whatever the vaccine is that they're going to deliver. And it seems to me that people don't realize that, well, sure, if they didn't take that money from the government, then they would just charge more for the vaccine upon delivery. You know, I mean, this is an economy. And they also seem to treat the federal government like they're a bunch of idiots negotiating contracts, and they're just handing out money left and right. And I'm going to stop my rant right here, but maybe, I think there's a lot wrapped up in that rant. And I'd like each of you to kind of talk about it, because I think the naivete of the people who hold this position, they don't understand business. They don't understand how you take basic science and you commercialize it. And they don't understand the important incentives that is necessary to get investment money off the sidelines to make this happen. So let's go around the horn. And Hans, since I made you go last, I'll make you go first this time. And we'll go in reverse order so Eric, you're going to have the tough time to think of what you need to say. Hans.
Oh, well, I might have passed it on to Eric, but I will leave that for Gene, for you to decide. I will, I would add maybe two things. One is, it's true, but from early on in the COVID epidemic, like we've heard in public discourse, quick calls to say, well, this is extraordinary. We have to do something extraordinary about intellectual property. Quickly, there were calls for open patent and IP pledges. There were calls for compulsory licensing. And the rationale is usually either tied to older narratives that IP obviously has always been a problem to access, and we can't afford these kinds of problems now. The other arguments, some other arguments have been more, I think, procedural. It's been said that, well, during these times of emergency, can companies or actors who want to respond really afford the time to negotiate complicated licenses like they would normally do to their IP rights? Wouldn't it just be better to pledge open access to their?
Because they can't walk and chew gum at the same time.
Well, maybe, Eric can say something about that after I'm done, which hopefully will be soon. I would just say first of all, I think COVID has shown us that providing naked access to IP, just access to patents, is probably not going to, almost certainly not going to solve this crisis. What we need is not just access to IP. What we need is companies to find each other, to come together and bring to the table their abilities, capacities, resources, and technology. That is so much more than giving somebody just mere access to your patents, that it's really very difficult to compare. The other thing I would say is that for all intents and purposes, for all that we can observe in the marketplace right now, is that certainly the industry has never moved as quickly with as many resources as we've seen it during times of COVID. So what we do observe is that companies find each other and they're able to set up collaborations at remarkable speed. Right? I'd be interested in Eric's thoughts, at the risk of skipping the line, whether Eric has experienced licensing negotiations or IP as a rate limiting step, or where he sees the stumbling blocks. But I've never.
Yeah, no, we can go to Eric, and what I would say is, and we talked about this, Hans. Melissa was your deputy at Bio was on a webinar with me earlier in the week, and we talked about this, that there really is no evidence of patent rights or IP rights getting in the way. Everybody is doing what you would hope that they would do during a crisis, is they're collaborating and cooperating, and they're worrying about these rights later on down the road. And I think we're going to see, just like any other moonshot, quote unquote, endeavor, that there's going to be great science, great engineering that are going to lead to great things. And giving up the rights to those great things down the road doesn't make any sense, but collaborating to save the planet right now is what we're seeing, right? Right, Eric? I mean, is that your reality?
Absolutely. So I'll skip the line here, apparently. And, you know, you and Hans both hit the nail on the head as it relates to the response to the coronavirus pandemic. Starting in roughly January and February, we have seen an absolutely unprecedented surge of collaboration across all manner of the biopharmaceutical industry. And in fact, you've seen companies that ordinarily would be fierce competitors working together. And the things that have been particularly impressive are just the sheer number of collaborations that have been announced. But I think the other piece that's even more important than the formal licensing collaborations really are the unprecedented degree to which the organizations developing coronavirus vaccines, therapeutics, antibodies, and others are actually sharing data and information. It's been widely reported, for example, that the heads of R&D of most of the large pharma firms working in this space are talking on a weekly basis about how they exchange data that they're finding. But it's absolutely clear that patent rights at this point are not the rate limiting factor in getting effective therapeutics to market and out to the benefit of patients who need them. You know, if anything, it's some of the more prosaic things. I think within the last couple of months, it's been reasonably widely reported that, in fact, one of the rate limiting factors is likely to be the availability of pharmaceutical grade glass for vials to put the vaccines in once we actually hopefully get an effective vaccine. You know, no patent in the world is holding that up. It's literally a supply chain problem. But I think, Gene, you're trying to talk there, I think, and you may be muted.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, the webinar that I did earlier this week, I had a doctor from the CDC's Board of Advisors on with us, and he explained something I had not read anywhere, that these vaccines, these early vaccines, are going to need to be stored. One of them is going to need to be stored at -70 degrees, and another one is -30 degrees. I mean, that is in and of itself going to be extraordinarily limiting.
Yes,
You know?
absolutely. There's going to be cold chain storage required. But I think, you know, the other thing to point out is this coronavirus pandemic has actually provided an absolutely ideal archetype for how licensing should happen. So if you look at many of the major players in the vaccine space, the Pfizer vaccine program is actually licensed in from BioNTech. You've seen GlaxoSmithKline provide rights to their adjuvant to multiple parties, so they're working together with Sanofi, for instance. At the same time, Glaxo has forged a broad collaboration with Vir Biotechnology, working to develop monoclonal antibodies. We've seen multiple competitors license rights to each other. So, for example, Amgen and Eli Lilly announced within about the past week or two that they are now working together to manufacture therapeutic antibodies if they should be successful at bringing them to market. Well, it happens they're both developing competing antibodies. Regeneron has engaged Roche as a manufacturing partner. So I think what in practice we are seeing in the response to the coronavirus across the biopharmaceutical industry is a demonstration across firms large and small that patent rights are not a limiting factor in getting therapeutics and vaccines out to the global population. I'll cite one last example. So we've heard a lot of news, certainly in this country, about remdesivir, the antiviral drug for which Gilead has received an approval to treat coronavirus infection. Now, it looks like they're going to be the ones bringing it to market in the United States and much of the developed world. But effectively, immediately when they received, or immediately around the time they received the emergency use authorization in the United States, they broadly licensed production rights for that molecule to multiple companies to allow those therapeutics to be deployed in the developing world. So we're really seeing across the industry exactly what you would want to see, a focus on bringing effective therapeutics and vaccines to market. And they're doing it in a way that takes advantage of the unique capabilities and assets that each firm has.
Yeah, and so what I see is that the patent system is working. I see the licensing system is working exactly as designed. And Dr. Copan, I'd like to let you comment on anything that Hans or Eric has said, but I'd also like people who don't know you, and maybe in this industry that's not very many people, because you had real chops in the licensing area, and you really had particular expertise with startup companies and licensing and helping people grow and acquire technologies. And if you could speak to that, because I think that the people just don't understand how important it is to be able to, one, have the technology and get it out there for others so that you can then fund yourself. And then two, to be able to acquire the technology that you're missing so that then you could do great things with the pieces that you do have. So I let you take it where you may, but please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gene. And I resonate with the comments that have just been shared by Eric and Hans. This is a time where we've seen extraordinary engagement of the community, and having a reliable system and the support of a strong intellectual property rights network and access to licenses have enabled a very flexible and rapid response. The role of the public sector here has also been remarkable. We've seen technology transfer offices and licensing offices across the nation and really globally step up with new access to intellectual properties, capabilities, and data, express licenses, if you will, and in some cases, access to ancillary technologies, at least initially on a royalty-free standardized basis, to just simply open up the door to innovation and working out the details in a schedule to follow. To me, the power of the system of licensing, and it was Hans who mentioned this, that very often the federal investment is just the starting point. It results in a discovery, it results in a piece of intellectual property, but ultimately the value creation is in the hands of the follow-on investors and the collaboration between the public and private sectors, and the relationship between startup companies who have access to clear rights through their license deals and through the clear understanding of the patents that they have received, now creates an opportunity for an investment cascade to create new value propositions, new partnerships in the economy. And these are things that I've seen throughout my entire career in IP and in licensing and in venturing. And so it's a thrill to be at an institute like NIST that has the oversight and the stewardship really for the key policies in technology transfer beginning with the Bayh-Dole Act and really looking to its future and to make sure that we have the right kind of stewardship, but also the flexibility so that at times like this, that we can have agile response to the crises at hand.
Yeah, I think that's really important. John, I want to bring you in here too, to this before we start going back around robin again. And if you want to talk about any of the COVID stuff, that's perfectly fine. But I know as Dolby, probably not too into the life sciences area, but and maybe I'm gonna share a little bit of information about myself. I mean, I'm really an audiophile. I love sound. I am tone deaf in that I can't hear myself, but I can hear other tones, and I love good sound, and there is just something about sitting in the theater, and when that movie comes on and the Dolby comes on, and I get a chill, and I'm getting a chill right now. I'm a geek. I'm getting a chill just thinking about it, right? I mean, so it's just wonderful. But we talked when we were talking about in our preparation for this, something that so many companies, not just American companies, companies around the world, but we've seen in America, in our experience, over and over and over again, as industry changes. We've gone from film to digital, watching in movie theaters, now we're watching online, and now movie theaters aren't even open largely in a lot of places. Dolby has innovated from the analog to the digital world in changing. Can you talk to us about how important getting the ability, because you guys are R&D focused. And I think you said that 90% of your revenue is licensing, or some high number is licensing. Without that, you couldn't be continuing to push the envelope. Can you talk about what this means to Dolby? Is it one, an American company, and two, is it an American innovator that continues to push the envelope?
Absolutely. So, I think that you said a lot that I agree with about our company and our technologies, but I think it's always helpful to think about maybe how we got started and use that as an example of how we're able to continue to deliver our technologies over time. We were founded by Ray Dolby, who had developed some technologies regarding noise reduction in magnetic tapes. And at the time, basically consumers were receiving their music on vinyl LP, but magnetic tape was used in the recording studios, and compared to vinyl, it had a high frequency noise due to the way that it was created. And Mr. Dolby developed some technologies that could reduce that noise and received patents on them, and founded the company around building equipment for use in recording studios for the use of noise reduction in magnetic tape. And then moving from the 60s through the 70s and even forward through time, you saw the advent of the cassette tape, which was a consumer product. And there was a clear application for the same technology in the consumer market. But at the time, Mr. Dolby had a small company. He was dealing in a very intimate, smaller professional space. And he had to deal with the question of how do you get into the consumer market? The traditional path at that time would have probably been to scale, to start to build cassette recorders, but he took a different path. He started licensing the various manufacturers of cassette playback equipment. And this has proven to be a very effective technique because on the one hand, he was participating in the market as a collaborator with all the various players and able to talk to all the various players more openly because he wasn't a competitor. If you go down the value chain, there was no level at which he was really competing with any particular component manufacturer, product manufacturer. Rather, he was able to get a sense of the ecosystem and tailor the technology to it. This became more valuable over time as technologies shifted. We're talking about analog magnetic tape, and now we're in a digital world where there are multiple various formats where technology is disseminated or content is disseminated to consumers. And by being able to focus on R&D and licensing the way that we were, somewhat decoupled from the product market, when the product market evolved, we were still able to remain intact, to keep our engineers and our core competencies and our knowledge intact, and simply reapply it to other applications. And I think we saw that in cinema, when cinema shifted from analog to digital, we were able to retool and develop technologies there. And then as digital moved from cinema to HDTV and DVD and elsewhere, we were well poised to offer our technologies to applications there as well. I'll end with one additional story, which I think is great from our experience, which is if you go to the advent of digital cinema, there was actually a challenge, a technical challenge, because you have the film, the 35 millimeter film that was being displayed, and the real estate was already spoken to with the analog tracks. So what Dolby's engineers developed was actually a clever method of printing our digital sound in between the sprocket holes in the film. And if you recall, film has these little holes on the side, and we print our film there. But we had to develop compression to do that. And those compression algorithms were then reapplied to broadcast and streaming and other applications where compression is very important. So I think that not only has the ability to license our rights and to work as partners with downstream manufacturers benefited us as a company, but I think it has also really benefited the consumers at large, because we are able to do things like take skills and knowledge we've developed either over a lengthy history in perhaps analog, or perhaps dealing with problems that have been arisen and challenges in one format, and reapply them to others and disseminate that knowledge to solve new problems, and perhaps bring those perspectives to new problems that would not necessarily have been evident to the manufacturers of the equipment in that space.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a couple of questions here about collaboration, which, it has become already been mentioned a couple of times, actually, probably, I think by all of you on some level. So let's take this first question. Eric, this specifically to you. Does the collaboration that you refer to continue after COVID? To other industries and technologies will it extend? Is there a greater accepted benefit to greater collaborations moving forward? In other words, is this the new normal?
Yeah, so Dana, thanks for the question there. I think what I would say is coronavirus has simply, kind of shown in a somewhat more public setting that this sort of collaboration is how the industry works. Hans described it nicely within his introduction. But again, the reality is, within biomedical innovation, you often find the groundbreaking discoveries coming from, small labs, the one inventor who thinks really differently than everyone else. And it often quickly becomes apparent that person, that organization, that institution, they simply don't have the right capabilities to take that discovery and ultimately bring it to market and bring it to the benefit of the population at large. And that's what licensing can do. And this is something that has happened, and I'm quite certain will continue to happen. Now, will we see the speed and scale of collaboration and the sheer number of deals that we saw announced around coronavirus partnerships in the sort of February, March, April timeframe? I'm not sure that we're going to see quite that scale. But collaboration and intellectual property moving from one institution to the next to take advantage of each one's capabilities and expertise and geographic footprint and the like, that sort of thing's absolutely going to continue.
Yeah. Hans, let me ask you that same question. I mean, you have 1,100 member companies. Do you sense that what Eric is saying is his experience is also the experience that you see from your companies as well, that the collaboration is going to continue in some form or fashion?
Well, yes, because it will definitely continue, because it always has been like such an important element of how the biotech ecosystem can work and does work. We have, of course, asked the same question of our members, right? Do you think, like, of all the lessons that we learn from COVID, which ones do you think will stick, right? Which ones will be around, and which ones will just, not just, but will end up being an extraordinary response to extraordinary circumstances. I think the jury is still out. We hear universally that companies, some of which now have tried new things that they haven't tried in the past, have concluded, you know, that didn't work so poorly. For example, right, the striking up a collaboration before a license agreement has been negotiated to a point to which it would ordinarily have been negotiated in the past, right? Transferring materials quickly on just MTA letters and a general letter of intent that sets out parameters for the collaboration that the companies have in mind. That has certainly happened routinely now. And we have heard from our member companies that, well, you know, maybe in the future when the situation is right, you know, this experience has given us the assurance that nothing terrible is going to happen. And if all goes well, right, we will learn not just valuable lessons, but also skills and confidence to do drug development in largely the same framework, but more smoothly going forward. I think where it's really going to matter is, though, because we're still a little early to discuss what the new normal will be, there's one thing we do know for sure, and that is that this will probably not be the last pandemic that we're dealing with, right? So we will, once we've beat this thing, really need to have a sit down with industry, with government, with everybody who is involved, and talk about how do we prepare for the next one, because now we can't be complacent anymore. We always knew that this kind of thing could recur. It was only a matter of time. This time we've been lucky. I hate to say this, but the COVID virus could have been,
you're right. Absolutely.
It could have been a virus like MERS, like the related coronavirus, Middle East, which had a case fatality rate of 30%. Can you imagine? Right?
Well, at the beginning, we thought this was going to have a 15%. I mean, this is a very different disease if it kills 15% of the people who get it.
Yeah. Right. So we can think of it as, first of all, we have to deal with this, but it's also a kick in the pants, if you will, to really prepare. And I think there will be many so interesting questions to discuss. I think it's been also true in the past that all the activities around pandemic preparedness in themselves often have not been very commercially rational propositions for private equity investment in the industry, right? It's not an easy commercial proposition to companies to say, we want you to invest in pandemic preparedness for a pandemic that we don't know what it's going to look like or when it's going to come. Are you really going to use equity capital for that when your obligation is to pursue some, I mean, you see what I'm getting at. But to go back, these are certainly questions that we hear being on the minds of our member companies. Many member companies, when they come up for air, voice thoughts about what the world is going to be like once we've moved past this emergency. And I don't have a good answer other than it's going to be full of lessons that we've learned this year.
Yeah, and I do think it's a lot of these things are going to be the new normal, because I am convinced that once we do come up for air and people can reflect, we're going to see that there's all kinds of innovations. There was all kinds of beneficial collaborations. And as long as the antitrust people stay away and, you know, and people didn't cross any lines, you know, which I don't think that they have, and I haven't heard anything to suggest that they have, that you're going to see all kinds of new, creative, exciting developments. And that will just be too enticing for companies to back away from. The next question along these lines, Dr. Copan, comes to you from AJ. And in light of these collaborations during the pandemic that Eric and Hans have now discussed, is this also happening with respect to the government? Is the government collaborating more than normal? And what can the government do, and what is the government doing in order to enhance licensing? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the attempts to update the Stevens-Weidler and the ROI initiative there a little bit more in detail, perhaps.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Ajay, for the question. Um, there is an extraordinary level of collaboration across the federal interagency at truly unprecedented levels in government. And a lot of this is the focus on new agility, both within government as well as at the interface with the private sector. And so it's an exciting time as we look at the need for agility in business, generally speaking. And so there's an embrace, I believe, for new technologies, new approaches that I believe are going to be long-lasting in the economy and will enhance the competitive position of the United States in our innovation system. NIST has issued what we call the Green Paper as a result of what I've affectionately called the Return on Investment Initiative, which simply looks at, are we in this nation able to create the greatest potential value for our society, for our economy, from the investment in science and technology from the public sector, primarily federally funded research. And so we've identified a series of findings that are captured in the Green Paper available on the NIST website that are leading to a series of legislative actions and recommendations. Much of this is also looking at the culture of innovation in our country and also best practices available from the nation's universities, startups, and federal institutes. And so I think that the kind of change that we're looking at is a durable change. And I also believe that it's built on a solid foundation of the U.S. innovation system, which needs to continue to adapt so that we can have the type of agility necessary to maintain U.S. economic and industrial competitiveness for the future. And I'm excited also about the series of legislative proposals that are on the Hill now that are looking at new ways of enhancing investment, enhancing collaboration. And we've seen this also in not only in the series of proposals that have come out from the NIST ROI initiative that are looking to streamline the toolkit that's available to us and make new approaches available to support effective licensing and partnering. But we're also seeing that the Institutes of Public-Private Partnership, and one that's directly associated with NIST, is the National Institute for Innovation and Manufacturing Biopharmaceuticals, NIMBLE for short. And it's co-located with the University of Delaware. But the amount of collaboration that we're seeing there, the access to intellectual properties that are part of that public-private partnership, a new spirit of collaboration is truly evident throughout our ecosystem, and I really do believe that lessons will be learned, to Hans's point, and some of these will really stick, and we'll find that these are enabling tools for the innovation ecosystem of the future.
Dr. Copan, what is the title? We have a question of that Green Paper that you referred to. Do you know? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. It's called NIST Special Publication 1234. You can just find it, a quick search on the NIST Green Paper, Special Publication 1234. It'll pull it right up. And it's the Initiative for Unleashing American Innovation. It's been part of a national conversation. The private sector, our nation's universities, trade associations, have all participated. And one of the things that's also come out of this is also looking for how do we incentivize innovation for the future, looking, for example, to redefining our R&D tax credit so that it will enable greater focus on the kind of collaborations on the future of standards-based investment. That's just so important for the nation's economic competitiveness and for our ability to invest in high-risk, early-stage enterprises, and really look at that as an important element of the U.S. economic system and the juggernaut that we are globally. How do we maintain that competitive, innovative edge in the face of hyper-competitive global environment?
And it's, with you bringing up standards, that's interesting because NIST signed on to that recent statement about standards, and I want to bring John into that as well, because standards are an important part for Dolby, obviously. But before I bring John in, Doctor, can you tell us a little bit about why did NIST join? Why now? Why is that an important issue for NIST?
NIST has a mission for U.S. innovation and economic competitiveness, industrial competitiveness. And NIST had seen that the 2013 policy position that we did not sign on to had actually created some confusion in the marketplace, and actually was used by global competitors to undermine the position of standards essential patents and licensing, and the ability of innovators to actually enforce or to have remedies available to them because of that lack of clarity. And so it was intent to support U.S. innovation, competitiveness, and the strength of our standard system. Although we did not join in with the PTO and the Department of Justice in 2013, we were very much at the forefront of bringing about this this sort of collaborative policy piece. Again, seeing that there need to be appropriate balances in place so that economic output can be stimulated, and that intellectual properties that are important for economic use are not going to be hijacked, are not going to be, and that we don't have a system of infringement at will, but we have a system that actually encourages appropriate action by the parties, and with remedies now to be seen in the clear light of day.
Yeah, and John, I want to bring you into this because I know standards are very important to Dolby, and I almost don't know what to say. There are certainly a number of patent owners that are in the standards area that do feel or did feel that implementers were to some extent hijacking their innovations. They were using the innovations. They weren't paying for them, and they weren't negotiating fairly. They were. I don't want to necessarily go down that whole path. I mean, feel free to if you would like to, but that's a different conversation for a different day, I suppose. But what I'd like to get to, and maybe have you speak to, is what is it, the investment that is necessary in order to bring a standard to being, right? Because these are wholly different types of innovations. You're creating something out of whole cloth that the entire industries are going to rely on. And it's where basic science meets fundamental engineering, and that takes a lot of effort. And if you can't get paid for that, you can't do it.
Yes, I think Dolby's been fortunate. We have relationships with quite a few partners who do contribute or who do help us bring our technologies to market, and we find that strong intellectual property protection and a clear system really helps us to structure those relationships in a manner that allows us to get a fair return. I think it's vitally important when we talk about standards and the standardization process to really think about, again, as you alluded to, Gene, what that really entails. I mean, from the perspective of a company like Dolby, we have ongoing R&D efforts, and we develop technologies in-house. And I think it's fair to say that we think about how can we get that to market. There are some areas where we offer, more complete branded solutions. And another area that we often work in is in contributions to collaboratively develop standards. And, I think there's some benefit in just explaining that these processes are driven by technical contributions by their members. Various standards development bodies will have large working groups organized with dozens, if not more, members who will come to meetings presenting in writing their contribution to the group, which will then lead to spirited discussion and debate as to how to best incorporate the technical contributions of the various members of the group. And just as one would often seek for to receive patent protection prior to publishing a paper in a conference or somewhere else, most of these parties will also seek to have patent protection prior to disclosing their work to the technical committee. Then ultimately the technical committee will synthesize the contributions and actually publish a standards document. And that document then, along with oftentimes additional information that's provided by the standards body and reference designs and other testing information, will then serve as the input for any company that would choose to take that document and use that as a basis for their design. So there's all this information flow coming out, and then that's just really being published. And the question is, what's the incentive for us to provide our knowledge in this manner as opposed to through some other manner? And that is because we have patent rights, and those patent rights allow us to enter into agreements with the parties that ultimately do take the public standard and adopt it into their product, and they allow us to negotiate with them for a fair return that then we can then reinvest into our process. In most years recently, I think we've been reinvesting about 20% of our revenues back into R&D, and this pipeline is one of the components of that revenue. So it's very important for us that we do get a return when we disclose technologies in this manner.
Yeah. Well, guys, we, believe it or not, are at the end of our hour here. I want to give each of you the opportunity. This has been a fascinating conversation, but I want to give each of you the opportunity to, in lightning round fashion, summarize, or if you, maybe better to say, what is the one thing that you hope people will leave this panel remembering? John, let's start with you. What's the one thing that you hope people remember from today?
I hope that the audience can learn that licensing, which is protected by IP rights, is really a mechanism that can foster a variety of different collaborative arrangements between parties that focus on R&D and that have new ideas, and parties that can specialize and focus in developing consumer-facing implementations of those technologies. And I think that there are instances where not just the companies involved, but the consumers at large can really value by having arrangements between different groups of companies working in the same ecosystem. I think oftentimes this can lead to more radical innovation, to the more widespread adoption of technologies, and also to the development of interoperable ecosystems that really allow parties to work together.
Great, thank you, John. Hans, your final parting thoughts. What's the one thing you hope people remember from today?
Well, the one thing in the context of discussing COVID, I would say is we have established systems for disseminating technology that must be allowed to work. I believe it's the safer and most efficient way during times of public health emergencies to leverage existing systems and not to interfere with their function, not now, right? Second, capital is necessary for innovation, right? Our companies compete not just in the market for products, they don't just compete in the market for innovation, but they also compete for capital. And capital moves around. I think John's company is awesome, but I would hate it if the investors from my companies would step away from us and give John all the money that they would otherwise have given us in investments. Capital is very sensitive, I think, to policy changes. So if I had one final thing I would leave is I would always urge caution when the proposition is that the government should interfere with existing business relationships with long established licensing practices I think there's nothing worse for investment in innovation than changing the rules of the game after long-term investments have been made in like reliance on established legal systems that are now up for grabs and up for change. That I think always requires very careful assessment and a very careful approach.
The funny thing is the courts get that with respect to real property. They don't so get that with respect to intangible property, but it is no less important. Thanks, Hans. Eric, your parting thoughts for today. What's the one thing you hope everybody remembers?
Sure, and I think I'll kind of touch on points that John and Hans have already made, but I think it's always going to be important to remember that licensing provides an optimal and efficient means for putting novel innovations in the hands of organizations most capable of bringing them to the benefit of the public. And really this coronavirus pandemic that we're seeing is really showing how that the system is functioning as it should in the biomedical industry. And you know, as a result, we are now seeing therapeutics and vaccines, in some cases already brought to market, or at a minimum, moving more rapidly than really we've ever seen in human history.
Great, thanks a lot, Eric. I appreciate it. Dr. Copan, your final thoughts for us today.
I think that intellectual property and licensing creates a virtuous cycle of innovation that benefits our nation, that benefits society, and that benefits economic activity. It fuels further innovation. And so as we look at the power of our system to the point that's been made, we need to preserve the essential elements for reliability of our innovation system in the future.
Great, thank you very much. My final thought is very simply, the founding fathers set up a patent system that they knew was going to lead to licensing. Most inventors, the overwhelming number of inventors in 1790 were inventors that did not have a high school education or had barely a high school education. They did not control the manufacturing, they did not control the channels of distribution. The founding fathers knew very well that they were going to take the rights that were given and were going to license them to people who controlled manufacturing and distribution. It's worked extraordinarily well. And over the last 40 years, thanks to Stevens Weidler and thanks to Bayh-Dole particularly, it's worked better and better and better. Those people who want to blow this up, they have the burden to come up with something better. And I don't know how you can come up with something better that has created all these jobs and contributed to this level of GDP. I'm willing to listen, but exploding something that works so well, they have a very heavy burden. So that's my final thought. And gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our sponsors. Brian, do you have a final thought for us today?
I do. Thank you, Gene, and thanks to all the panels for such a great panel. And later this afternoon, we'll turn our sights outside the United States for our second panel of the day. That panel, entitled The Effects of Global Licensing, starts at 4 p.m. Eastern. I hope you'll join us then as well, and I hope we have as great a conversation as we did on this panel today. Thanks very much.